Just a few things I'd like to announce here. First of all, the idea that Primetime at the BU Library is designed to celebrate the experiences and the accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. It's a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, faculty development, and other offices on campus. Most of the presentations are recorded and can be found in the BU Digital Library. Be sure to check the library's news and events webpage and the BU calendar for what's coming up on the schedule. On Thursday, April 7th, Dr. Wade Neward, Professor of Chemistry, Dr. Trey Maddox, Associate Professor of Chemistry, Zoe Vermeer, Senior in Political Science and Communication Studies, and Max Werner, Junior in Physics Mathematics, will share their stories and their highlights of the interim history of science in Europe study abroad experience. Today, we welcome April Schmidt, Associate Professor of English, Heidi Kao, Art, Emily Swanberg, Art, Kelsey Widman, English, who will share the creative process and lessons that were learned from their artistic and literary collaboration for the publication of April's upcoming spiritual memoir. Okay, let's give them a welcome here, please.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. Ooh, I feel like I'm in a stadium. Okay, that's not good. At least I have the security of this podium, right? All right, you've gotten the introductions here. You probably can already tell that this was a non-traditional project here. So what we're going to talk with you about today is what happens when you collaborate. What is the magic that comes out of collaborating? What do you do with failure in that process? But to give you a little bit of a sense of what we've done, you'll see some images cycling through up here, some pieces of the process. So what was the project that we worked on? Well, on one level, it was a book. That's what we were trying to do, publish a book, which on the surface it seems like would just be a solo project, right? This is, especially when it's memoir, this is something I do by myself, is how you'd think that it would go. I wasn't interested in that. I don't particularly love the spotlight, and that didn't seem very fun or creative to me. So what is the other thing that we were trying to do? That's a much bigger question. It's practical in some ways, which is practical and it's philosophical, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today addresses the overlap between those. How is it that you make something beautiful together? How does that happen in real time with stuff? And what is happening kind of in the relationships, in the spirit, in the philosophy, in the conceptual ground in that process. So I think this is probably the best way to describe what it is that we were trying to do on a large scale. And this comes from Makoto Fujimura. Does anybody know him? He's a painter, has written about culture care. This is from him about beauty. And I think as much as it can be a little bit embarrassing to say what we were trying to do is make beauty, I think that's really what we were trying to do under this kind of a definition. Beauty is the quality connected with those things that are in themselves appealing and desirable. Beautiful things are a delight to the senses, a pleasure to the mind, and a refreshment for the spirit. Beauty invites us in, capturing our attention and making us want to linger. Beautiful things are worth our scrutiny, rewarding to contemplate, deserving of pursuit. They inspire or even demand a response, whether sharing them in community or acting to extend their beauty into other spheres. So that's what we were that's one of the things we were trying to do. Publish a book, create something beautiful. Kelsey's going to share a little bit more about what else we were trying to do in this process of working together.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. I was April's intern for this. The really fancy title I came up for myself was Executive Publications Assistant. And so we knew we wanted to create something with integrity, which meant that there needed to be cohesion between all the different elements. The text itself, the cover design, social media, other design elements like the back cover, and other extra textual materials like the back cover text or discussion questions. And so with all these different elements, we found it a bit difficult to verbalize exactly what we wanted it to be. We knew we wanted it to be beautiful, but in terms of coming up with like a thing that we wanted, we weren't sure what to say. However, we were able to kind of generally agree on some things that we didn't want it to be. We didn't want it to be propaganda. We didn't want it to turn into something that was just made to be just consumed. And we didn't want to use sentimentality or preaching because one of the problems with a lot of preaching and also a lot of advertising is it tends towards proselytizing or just trying to draw in people with easy answers instead of creating a set of questions or problems, which we saw as one of the purposes of art, to create this space for greater conversation and personal consideration of the material. So then our next question was, how can we do that together, working in all these different elements, especially if we know more of what that isn't than what it is. Is it possible for us to create something with unity, cohesion, and integrity without trying to establish this really strict set of rules or a legalistic structure that might cut us off from it turning into something that we can't even conceive of at the current moment? So I think Heidi and Emily are going to talk now.
I'll bind this a little bit. So that was the project, right? What was the project? And now thinking some more about how did we make something beautiful together? Heidi and Emily were the designers. You're seeing much of their work. You can tell they're the ones working on it there. And so they're going to speak some about what they did in terms of what did this look like? How is it that we make something beautiful together, doing that integrity both on the physical and that kind of conceptual process?
Hello, I'm Heidi and this is Emily, and we were a part of the design process with April. So this process actually began in the fall when Jesse Henderson, one of our design professors, emailed us and a couple other students to just apply and thought would be good for this project. But we decided that with all the other busy commitments that we had going on with senior year, that we would actually collaborate, even though we didn't know each other that well. So with Jesse's encouragement, we decided to just submit a design together and see kind of what happened. So during this process, we both came from backgrounds that were strong with design, but we also had fine art backgrounds. I'm interested in illustration and Emily's a sculptor. And so we decided that it would be best to play to our strengths and that we would both do what we felt was our strong suit, and then we would carry on with that. So during the process, it was a lot of collaborative work, and we continued to just talk back and forth and make sure that the process was really both of our work.
Our early drafts of the design were very experimental. We knew we wanted to include both illustration and sculpture in some way, so early on we did a lot of individual brainstorming, but after several misfires, trying out a bunch of different materials and fabrication methods, we were able to come up with something that was a little bit more refined together. We eventually landed on literally weaving the drawing through the sculpture, and we actually have a small mock-up of that in the PowerPoint. Heidi just made like a small little leafy sketch, and I just had like a little letter of drywall in my studio, so we put them together, and that was the vision that we kind of established for the cover. And so after working with April and consulting with the photography professor, Lex Thompson, and getting feedback from Jesse on the design, we were able to land on something that we felt reflected the book in an adequate way, and that I think we're pretty happy with. So,
okay. All right. Throughout this process, one of the things that I personally had to kind of deal with or get past is pushing past perfectionism and being willing to be uncomfortable with what I'm part of creating. This wasn't a typical internship position where I'm making copies or filling in spreadsheets or just copy editing drafts. I'm actually part of the drafting process, which is kind of terrifying. There was one point where I was working on a draft of the back cover text, and one of my roommates comments, "Oh wow, that's like one of the major factors in whether someone buys the book." Oh, okay, thanks, I hadn't even thought of that. But so there were several times when I was working on discussion questions or a blog post or a letter asking professors to use Triptych, where I just stopped and was like, this is crap. I should just quit. Like, I don't even want to know how terrible the next line I write is going to be. So the way I had to get past that was by first writing the draft that I hate, and then my job is to write a draft that I hate marginally less. and then writing a draft that I can maybe live with, and then writing a draft that I feel comfortable passing on to April, with like 3 drafts in the middle of that. And through all of that is the challenge of not giving into commercialism or the easy answers of consumption, which is particularly tricky with social media, which often feels like this big commercial rat race where it's all about who has the most retweets or likes, or whether you have the right balance of followers and following. And so one way we try to get around that is by giving whoever's out there something to engage with when they're following us, whether that's asking the followers a question that they may or may not respond to, or making a playlist of songs that were used in the writing of Triptych, or pointing people to something creative whenever possible. We also tried to include and listen to the voices of others, which at times meant publicly on social media, engaging with others, and for me personally also just meant listening and asking others' opinions, and fitting those into how I felt about the work itself. For example, in some of our early cover design decisions, when we were trying to just pick one out of all the wonderful options we had, I was having a conversation with a friend who was in one of April's classes at the time and had seen the covers but hadn't read the book, and he made just one comment about the cover we ended up picking, and that sparked this enormous revelation for me about why I really wanted it to be this cover, and what that cover meant for me in terms of the text. You can read about that revelation at aprilschmidt.com after we talk about failure.
Watch us dance. That's also a dance lesson.
Okay, so if you've been listening well and trying to synthesize what we're saying to you, put on my teacher hat, you may have noticed that much of the creative process and the collaborative process is this holding in tension the comfort, discomfort, right? Having this sense of, I don't like this, or I'm uncomfortable with part of this, but it's there, how do we respond to that? Trying to figure out what is it that we listen to as we try to move forward and as we try to make the work. So in a lot of the process, both in terms of drafting the text, in developing the cover, in developing the social media campaign and the things around it, a lot of that tension tilted toward you listen to the changes that are being suggested to you, right? Even if I don't particularly like the feedback I'm getting that this section doesn't work, I'm going to attempt to accommodate that. And that is what is going to make the work better, is responding to that feedback regardless of how I feel about it. So the creative process is definitely about encountering challenges. Generally, the boundaries challenge, and they usually deepen the work. They help to clarify it, or they help you understand, even if the work stays the same in response to the feedback. It often will help me, and this has been similar for all of you too, it will help us to understand that better. Now, like any good story, we've hit the sort of crisis point, right? Plot's been building. We have actually encountered legitimate failure in this process too. What happened for us is that we fired our publisher, or potentially resigned before they could fire us, a month before the release date for this book. That was a pretty major crisis, and it fell in line with the broader conflict, right? All you fiction writers, short story, plot mapping, the broader conflict here of what do you listen to, right? You bend the work, you modify the work, you refine the work, and that deepens it. At what point can you end up breaking the work? Is there a point at which the essential integrity of the thing will end up disappearing if you try to accommodate requests for change, for structure? And I take it as a really good sign that I see a few of the artists nodding right now. Good, okay, I'm on the right track in text. If I'm matching where you are in the visual world. So there were both textual and communication issues involved with the choice to leave the publisher that we were with. But the breakdown in the process and this illustration of trying to figure out how much do you bend and at what point do you kind of step to the side was most clear in the cover design process. So Heidi and Emily are going to talk a little bit about what happened there, and know that it wasn't all on the design process. And Heidi and Emily, the sorts of things that they talk about were also happening in terms of conversation about text. And if any of you are interested in that, I have lots of email conversations with my former editor that I can share with you judiciously.
Okay, so in working with Kalos on the design, we quickly found that they had a lot of template requirements that they hadn't previously mentioned to us. And we were willing to do what we could to kind of fit within those requirements, as April mentioned, like they're professionals in the field. We should probably listen to what their feedback is. But there was one change that they were really, really insisting on that we weren't willing to make, which was increasing the title size significantly, like a lot. And there's a slide in there that has a big like red X over it, which is what they suggested to us. And the reason we were having such trouble with this suggestion was that one of the things that we really connected with about April's writing is how subtle and lyrical her words are, and we specifically made the title the size it is to reflect that style. So we felt that making that change would really compromise the design and really compromise the whole overall aesthetic of the book. As I mentioned, we were willing to budge a little bit, but they were not willing to take anything less than edge-to-edge text, and we thought that was too much. And so after several emails back and forth negotiating about the size of the publisher, it was very, very clear that they weren't willing to negotiate with us. And there were a few things where we could just tell they thought we were just undergraduate design students and they could tell us whatever they wanted and we would just do it, which was a little bit demeaning. But so we were just not having the relationship we needed to have with them in order to make the best product possible for April and for everybody involved. And so we decided to switch over to Whitman stock for publishing, and they were completely different. They were very confident in our design and gave us a lot of creative freedom to do what we thought was best for the book. They definitely made suggestions as well, which we listened to, but they were a lot more open to hearing our opinions about it and hearing our rationale for why we're making these specific decisions. And I think our choice to work with them is what really allowed us to create something that reflects April's work. So that was the best decision that we could have made. So that's that.
She did it all.
All right, so how is it, now I feel like this is a therapy session. I feel like what we're really talking to you about is how to have a healthy relationship, right, oddly enough, because we're talking about what do you negotiate, what do you not negotiate, at what points do you bend, what does it mean to bend without breaking, when is it necessary to break, when is it necessary not to break. This is what's interesting to me, and I know to us, about working in the creative process. This is part of why this feels like good work, like real work, the work, because it's engaging all of those kinds of questions about life. So what are the takeaways? What is your to-do list? How do you manage to have a healthy creative relationship? I think the things that we mostly discovered in asking, okay, how is it that you can make this magic, even in the face of failure or even through failure? How do you create a whole work of art? How do you create that beauty? A couple of things that came away from that. One is owning both your skills and your limits, right? Being really honest about, this is what I can do, this is what I know, this is what I can do well. And that knowing is a 360-degree thing. This is what I know in terms of what I sense, and this is what I know in terms of what I've studied. But owning your skills, what you know, I know this worked especially well for Heidi and Emily, who hadn't worked together before, each of them being honest about, okay, I can draw, okay, I can sculpt, okay, I'm better on the tech side, okay, I can keep up with the emails, and divvying out that work appropriately, which required each of them to know what their limits were, right? Even my conversations with my editor, what is it that I know about this work, and what is it that the editor might know better about this work as someone who has been outside of the creation of it. Trust people to do their work, trust that they are wise in the ways of their work. I think that's probably the most significant difference between the two publishers that we worked with. that at the first publisher, there was kind of a sense of being patronized, I think, that all of us experienced, largely because they hired us to do something and then didn't trust that we knew how to do it. So they hired me as a writer and then didn't trust that I knew most about how this text was going to work. They hired Heidi and Emily to be designers and didn't trust that they knew best how to do the work. Not that they couldn't engage feedback, but that what the suggestions that were being made to us were here's something that needs to be changed and here's exactly how to change it. Instead of when we worked in what I think was a more healthy relationship, where it was here's something that needs to be addressed, right? Kind of value neutral. Here's something that needs to be addressed. How could that be done? And then we, knowing the ways of our particular work, were able to come in and deal with that based on the wisdom that we had there. I think it was helpful for all of us to approach art making as a gift economy. You're not going to get paid enough for how hard this work is. There is not enough money for that, especially if you're doing the work as the work. And having the attitude of, I'm doing this for the sake of the work, I'm doing this for the sake of good beauty, to be generative, to make art, became sustaining. Because if this had been an economic exchange, this process would have stopped. It would not have been worth it, quite literally, to continue. Particularly because at the end of this, the royalties that I make on this book might buy me 2 cups of coffee, ever. So it can't be about that. Which the strangest thing, and those of you who have had me in class know I talk a lot about the ironies of the writing process and the creative process. But I think one of the things that we discovered at the base of all of this is that the way to make the best thing is to look through the thing. And Annie Dillard talks about this. She tells a story about staying on a cabin up in the northeast coast and trying to chop wood, because that was the only way that the cabin could be heated. And she spent a lot of time, as she says, making toothpicks. She was trying to chop this wood and ends up just shaving off the edges of it. And finally, some kind-hearted neighbor comes out and tells her, you have to look through it. You have to look through the log. Try to chop what's underneath. First time, perfect split, right? And this isn't about working together, being able to collaborate, being able to create something beautiful and generative. We discovered was not about trying to make a book or trying to make a cover or trying to have a social media campaign. It was about trying to do something that was much bigger and broader and deeper and frankly I think a lot more important than that in terms of that trying to be generative, trying to create community, trying to create beauty, and then on the way using your skills to end up with a social media campaign, a functional cover, the rest of that. So we've got time for some questions or comments if you have them, a fair amount of it. So we're happy, any of us, to address questions that you have. Please, somebody ask something so we don't feel dumb up here. Angela.
April, will you read a little bit?
You know, I actually didn't even bring any with me. Thank you for the segue, though. There will be another Primetime in the Library on the 21st of April, wherein I will be reading from the book, and books will actually be here by then. They are off the presses, but in a truck or an airplane or something right now. So yes, come back on the 22nd, and you'll get to hear some words from the work.
A lot of this was about knowing who to listen to, and I liked your comments about saying that a lot of times that feedback, you are intersecting paths with people who have different experiences, and so if those aren't the right things to accommodate, at least thinking about them makes you understand the work better, and I totally agree with that. So what were the points though where you decided this isn't what I want to listen to? What were the kind of biggest red flags, and I know, but you're really going to tell me that shift in type was worth firing a publisher over? So what's the
One thing.
Yeah. Okay.
And yes, it is worth firing a publisher.
Yes. Yeah. So Jesse's asking how what. I think what you're asking is not just what happened on the surface, right?
Why did you decide you didn't want to listen to them?
Right. What was the tipping point, or what had sort of accumulated? Are you two willing to talk a little bit more about the kind of the pressure behind that process, not just that they asked us to change the size and we didn't want to, but what did that stand for that made this non-negotiable?
Well, during the process, we went through a lot of different iterations of that text, and we landed on so many different versions. We had probably like 10 copies on the table, like which one do you like, which one do you don't like. So from the beginning, we just loved the small subtleness of it because of April's words and just what the book stood for and everything. And so that was something that was very dear to us from the beginning. And then they slowly kept asking us, increase it a little, increase it a little, increase it a little. And it was kind of working for us. And then we were like, well, we really want the image to speak to April's ideas of the book. And we don't feel like the title is something that needs to be loud in order for readers to engage it and come close to the book, because we thought the imagery would speak enough words. And Emily was dealing more with the actual Photoshop of it all, so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
In the increase it a little phase, we also realized that they weren't saying increase it a little, they were trying to get us to go edge to edge. So at one point they sent us like a mock-up of a previous book they had done, and they said they wanted to be this big, and it was the whole cover.
A third of the book.
Yeah, and eventually after we sent back and forth so many emails, they were like, you know what, it needs to be this size, and if you don't do it, we're gonna do it. And they weren't willing to hear our side and to hear like why we're making these decisions. And it really just felt like they had no concern for like what that cover was saying about the book. They were more concerned with how big is it going to be on the thumbnail on Amazon, is it going to sell that way? And we personally thought that the imagery was also capturing enough that like you would look at the book. And so we were just at a point where they clearly didn't have the same philosophy for the design that we had, and it was just that much of a fundamental difference that it became really frustrating. And so that we had to do something. So
one of the things that was also happening on the textual level, which is kind of like along the similar lines of this font increase, is there is this one particular line, and there were a couple other spots in the book also, but there was this one particular line near the end of the book that Kayla's really took issue with, and it's a very, very powerful line, and I've gotten to read all of the email exchanges between April and the editor and gotten very righteously angry about all of it, so I'll try not to rant too hard right now. But essentially what they finally admitted that it boiled down to was that this line was offensive to God because it was too powerfully written and expressed too much anger. And the kind of explanations that April kept trying to offer and that we kept going back and forth about in our own conversations was, well, this is an integral part to the next step in the book. It's the next plot point is not as compelling if not for this line, and that was another area where we were including this line as a vital part of the work, and they were looking at it more as how is this going to make us as the publishers look, rather than how is this going to add or detract from the work. So that was one of the things that was going on with the text itself.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and synthesize for you as the teacher here. So to answer your question, Jesse, I think we knew it was over, so to speak, when we realized that a couple of things were happening. One was that the communication had this sort of sneaky quality, like that they had expectations or standards or non-negotiables that they were, for some reason, hesitant to be clear about. That those were sort of coming out little by little. And I understand that in terms of if you are coming to knowledge of why we all have sort of strong gut reactions to things sometimes, and it can take some time to come to understanding about why we're having that response. But it became clear that that's not what was going on. And when we were trying to have dialogue and conversation about potential changes to the cover or to the text, it was clear that the people that we were talking with didn't really understand their own responses. And actually what that ended up doing for me is it eroded my trust in their perspective on it. And then it sort of became I'm not sure that you understand what we're trying to do here. Because you're asking for these things for these reasons, some of them which felt very legalistic, right? The title must be this size, doesn't matter what book, doesn't matter what font, it must be this way for reasons outside of the project, that somehow the feedback we were getting was no longer referential to the work itself and to the vision of that work. And not that, I think that sounds dangerously like we wanted it to be our way or the highway instead of their way or the highway, right? Which is just, that's not gonna get anybody anywhere. But the conversation was not taking place on the plane of what is the best representation of this work and elevating that, which is a little awkward to say when it's memoir, right? Because I have to do a lot of parsing between what's the difference between me and the work, but there is a difference. There's a significant difference between me and the work. And I had done a lot of sorting about that over the years, and that's sort of that's the professional work, I think, of being an artist in a lot of ways, is separating your own identity from the work, and then being willing to sacrifice pieces of your identity for that work. To be able to say, all right, even if I don't really like this change, if there's a good case that this is what's best for the work, then that's the direction that we're going to go. The sort of humility before the thing that you're trying to accomplish. Yeah, Chris?
April, given some of these problems, did you think about self-publishing? Did you talk about that at some point? And since you didn't, how do you see the publisher as a collaborator in the project, or the editor?
Yeah, good. Dr. Garretts is asking about self-publishing. And when we hit crisis point, I didn't, and those of you who know me as the control freak that I am, can probably assume that I didn't fire the publisher before having another publisher. The first publisher doesn't know that, but I hadn't signed documents, but we were in that sweet spot between, okay, I know that I can let this one go and the book is still going to come out. So self-publishing was on the table at that point because I have announced that there's a book coming out. I need to try to follow through on that, and I would like to try to follow through on that. And other people have given significant pieces of their energy and their life to this. And so kind of being willing to follow through with that. We're in an environment now where self-publishing isn't necessarily a hit, but it did feel like that a little bit. So facing that, being willing to be humble in terms of my own role in this before the work, that was one of the things. Am I willing to self-publish in order to follow through with what I've told all these people and what they've committed to in terms of there's a book coming out? And the arrangement with Whitford, who's the publisher now, ended up being a partial self-publishing thing in a lot of ways because the book had already been copy edited. There was an existing cover design. So I came to them and said, this is where we're at in the process, and this is the deadline that we have. Can we work together? And so the collaboration then became, for that one, less about the text itself and more about, okay, what is it that we actually both have right now in really clear, concrete terms? They have printing machines. I have a book. Can we work together here? It became, in some ways, very easy that way. Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's a prior question, which is, like you have a blog, right?
Mm-hmm.
You already have the capacity to share your memoir. You could share your design in other ways
Mm-hmm.
because of the nature of technological change. What is the virtue of having a book?
Yes.
And is that part of your collaborative approach to creation?
Yeah. What's the virtue of having a book? Part of that is just my completely insane, irrational love for books as artifacts. When I sat down with Jesse and a group of potential student designers at the very beginning, Jesse asked me, so what's your aesthetic? I said, well, this isn't going to be very helpful, but it's gorgeous. I want it to be gorgeous, okay? Go. And they did. That's the amazing thing, is that actually worked. They were able to actualize that. But the the virtue of having a book has some to do, and now you're going to get all sorts of philosophy here, has some to do with my belief in embodiment. Part of what's going on in this memoir is wrestling through what you're told about your faith and what you experience with your faith, right? Which is why there's this triangle thing that's all over this sucker. I have not experienced faith as being a journey down a narrow road. It's been something that's more like a container that has a lot of tension in it, that can hold some things, that can't hold other things. And part of that is about how is it that the spirit and the body exist with each other, and how do spirits exist with other bodies, and other bodies exist with my spirit, and all of those kinds of crossovers. And so having the book as a thing, to me, seems somehow essential to its expression. It's somehow part of what I'm trying to say. And then that also meant that the paper needed to feel nice, and the cover did. There were some pretty high standards there because of that. But I also have some concerns, and this is something that Kelsey and I talked a lot about in terms of social media. I have some concerns that a lot of what we do, no offense, a lot of what we do virtually the form can encourage us to consume each other. That the virtual form can encourage us to speed through things, that it can be anti-contemplative, that we're distracted, that's how it's built, that advertisements are going to pop in. The way that bloggers survive is to have a lot of sponsors on their sites, right? They survive on interruption. And as a Christian person trying to encourage people to sit with big, complicated, sometimes painful questions, I have really had a hard time working in that format. So there was something sort of offensive to me about trying to take this work and deliver it in that format. Any of you have something to add? Good. Yes, I did the thumbs up. Other comments, questions? Yeah, Peggy.
I do have a social media question. I mean, publishing at the very core is commercial. They have to make money. That's why they do these things. Social media at their core are commercial. A social media campaign is commercial. So when you say that you wanted to have a social media campaign that was commercial, how does that work? You know, with the sure.
Yeah. Thank you, social media professor, for asking that question.
Yeah.
This is good. It makes us prove our positions, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that was one of the challenges we had, was that we knew that it was, like, the nature of it is very commercial, and we knew that one of our endeavors is a very commercial endeavor. Like, we want people to buy the book. We want people to come to our events. We want people to, okay, I'll stop there because the next thing is, what we really want people to do is not just buy the book, but to think about the book and contemplate the book and engage with us on this journey, or whatever other cliche we want to call it. So it was difficult to figure out, okay, on some level this is going to need to just be commercial. I am going to need to fire off really cliche sounding tweets to get people to look at the blog or to check out the Instagram. But our goal has been to really, even though some parts are going to have to be commercial, take every opportunity to be creative in it and not let ourselves get lazy in the promotion, and not just kind of bow to the commercialism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's another instance of trying to see through the thing, right? And this is going to sound horrible, and I kind of can't believe I'm saying it, but if you think about Jesus, this for all of you, this is what it means to write spiritual memoir, is each time you do a reading, you have to decide if it's going to be more scandalous to say Jesus or the F word. And believe you, it's a real run for its money sometimes. But if you think about Jesus, there's this tension, right, around that model of Jesus as being meek, and Jesus as being subversive, right? Throwing tables over in the temple and some of that, and like being the ultimate servant. And the thing that helps me to see through that is this idea of Jesus always sort of saying, okay, but it's not about that. Okay, but it's not about that. Like saying to the Pharisees sort of all the time, okay, that is the law, but you know what? It's not about that. Like, that's there, but it's not about that. And I think that's a lot of how we've been trying to think about some of the social media and the commercialism. Not that it's a necessary evil. I think that's too easy of an answer. But instead, thinking about it in proportion. What is this for? This is a tool, not the thing itself. Yes, books need to be sold, but why? So that people can have an encounter of a greater kind. In order to enable other books to exist, right back to that gift economy. Part of the way that I've thought about the publisher's financial investment is thinking about it more broadly in terms of the community. Why does the publisher need to make money? Not necessarily so that they can sell more of my books, but so that other people's books can exist in the world, right? So I can read other people's stories, that I am part of this big whole thing, and that the big thing is the point. That we do an event or we do a reading not to sell more books, but to have an encounter. And I do believe enough in this work that I think people should buy it. I think it's worth encountering, and I've tried to do very well my work along the process of creating this to say, is it worthy to spend resources on this? Is this good enough to be worth the cost of the resources that go into it? And I think that's a real question for artists too, especially sculpture, and when you're working outside of the digital form, what comes out of the work, the encounter people have with it needs to be worth the cost of the materials at the very least. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Jay.
Just a little bit curious about your collaborative process. It appears that it works. I mean, you're still talking to each other and smiling at each other. I'm just curious what you feel made that collaborative process work, and perhaps maybe what some of the challenges were to it, how you kind of worked with those as well too.
Yeah, good.
One of the things we really found that made this process work, I think, is just trusting that we all know what we're doing, and that we are making the decisions we're making based on rational thinking. We're not just choosing these things arbitrarily, we're making these choices intentionally, and I think believing that, like, Kelsey will do a great job with the social media campaign, and like believing that April's writing will be great, and like believing in all of our skills is something that really helped move the process along without trying to step on each other's toes or take control of the whole thing all at once.
Guys, do something. I guess in particular, our relationship really started in the fall because we knew of each other in classes previously, but we didn't really work together at all. So it's kind of a miracle and a great thing that we just work so well together. And I knew that she was a great sculptor from the beginning, which goes back to trust. I just knew that she would do a good job, and she's really good at her craftsmanship, and she knows what she's doing. So that was like, I think that's kind of where it came back to, is a lot of trust. We just knew that we both wanted a high quality vision and image,
And from that trust, we were also able to be really brutally honest when we didn't agree with things. So I think just being open with what we wanted, but also being open to hear other people was super important.
One of the things we were actually joking about like 2 minutes before this started was that we all had similar levels of cynicism. So maybe that's part of the clue, which is probably not a good thing to say in a Christian environment. But I think a lot of it also goes back to what Emily and Heidi were just saying about that level of brutal honesty, but in a way that we feel comfortable. We all feel comfortable with that because we've all spent all of this time together, and we know how committed we all are to this work. And I think the work is one thing that we've talked about in our discussions or meetings is that a lot of times we think of people collaborating together in artistic ways because they already know each other, they already have a relationship, and they're like, hey, let's do this together. And maybe that goes well, and maybe it doesn't. But the way that it happened for us, and that ended up working really well, was that there was this work that we all connected to. I mean, April obviously connected to it because she made it first. I didn't know April very well before this process. I'd had her for a class and talked to her about some pieces, but other than that, that was basically all we knew about each other. And like Emily and Heidi said, they didn't really know each other before starting to work on this process. So there is this particular magic in finding work that we all connect to and all are passionate about, and then the relationship forms out of that because there is this really basic common link that we all have.
Good, well, we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for coming, for the great conversation. Come back again on the 21st.